You come here.
Prepare yourself!
Not without a fight. I will not abandon you. You are under
On the third
my
morning,
protection.
they came back to the river. There were 5 of them, Harlan Croft and 4 men who had been doing his bidding for long enough that they no longer thought of it as doing his bidding and simply thought of it as what they did. They came on horseback through the tree line at the edge of the Yazoo, where the bank widened into a shallow shelf of mud and root and dark water that moved slower than water should, as though the river itself was considering something. They had thrown Elias Drummond into this water 3 nights ago. They had chained his wrists to a length of iron and weighted it and let the current take him and ridden away satisfied that the river had handled what they had started. They came back on the 3rd morning because Harlan needed to see it confirmed. He was that kind of man, the kind who cannot fully enjoy a thing until someone has verified it for him. What they found on the bank stopped their horses. The chains were there. They lay in the mud at the water's edge, the iron dark and wet, the links intact. But they were open, not broken. Open, as though whatever had been inside them had simply been released by something that understood the mechanism of iron better than iron intended. And around the chains, in the mud, there were marks that none of the 5 men could name. Not animal tracks, not human footprints, something that had come from the water and returned to it, and had left only the suggestion of itself behind. Harlan sat on his horse and looked at the chains for a long time. One of the men said maybe he worked himself free and drowned downstream. Nobody answered him. 3 days earlier, Elias Drummond had been doing what he did every morning before the sun came up. He was at the river. He had been going to the Yazoo at sunrise since he was a boy. Since his father, Thomas Drummond, had first brought him to this bank when Elias was 7 years old and shown him how to sit at the water's edge without disturbing it, how to let the sound of it replace the sound of everything else, how to be still enough that the river forgot you were there and simply continued being itself in your presence. Thomas had given Elias a stone on the morning of his 12th birthday. Small, gray, flat, worn smooth on one face from years of river water moving over it. Thomas had carried it in his own coat pocket for 20 years and had pressed it into Elias's hand without ceremony and said, "The river gives and the river keeps." Remember both. Elias had carried the stone every day since. It was in his left coat pocket on the morning they came for him. Elias Drummond was 34 years old in the autumn of 1887. He had been born in the settlement of black families that had established itself along the western bank of the Yazoo 20 years earlier. Families who had come to this ground after emancipation with a particular combination of hope and wariness of people who understand that freedom on paper and freedom in practice are not the same thing and who intend to close that distance through work and documentation and community. One season at a time, he was a quiet man, as his father had been before him. He worked his land, he helped his neighbors with theirs, and for the past 2 years he had been doing something additional that nobody in the settlement knew the full extent of and that Harlan Croft had recently learned about through a man in the county seat who was not above passing information for a small consideration. Elias had been keeping a journal, not a diary, a record. He had been documenting, with the methodical care of a man who understood that truth without evidence is just testimony, and testimony without corroboration is just the word of one black man against several white ones. The systematic campaign of intimidation and theft that Harlan Croft and his associates had been conducting against the settlement for 6 years. Burned crops dated and described, land documents signed under duress or taken outright. He had the names of the families, the acreages, the dates. Men run off in the night with their families given a single hour's warning. 3 instances of violence that had been dismissed by the county sheriff as property disputes. He had written all of it down, every entry dated, every name spelled correctly, and 3 days before they came for him, Elias had wrapped the journal in oilcloth, sealed it with wax, addressed it to an attorney in Memphis named Walter Graves who had been recommended to him by a man at a church meeting in the next county, and given it to a woman traveling north on a wagon to put in the postal system at the first town she reached. The journal was already in transit when Harlan Croft learned about it. Harlan was not a complicated man. He was a man who had inherited land and a habit of dominance, and had never been asked to examine either. He had been terrorizing the black settlement along the Yazoo for 6 years, because 6 years ago he had decided that the land those families were farming should be his, and that the most efficient way to acquire it was not through legal purchase, but through attrition, through making the lives of those families so untenable that they would eventually leave, and that their leaving would be so quiet and so gradual that no record would survive to call it what it was. He had not anticipated Elias Drummond. He had not anticipated a man who went to the river at 5 in the morning and came back calm. A man who watched everything and said little and wrote down what he watched. A man whose neighbors trusted him with the details of what had been done to them, and who understood that those details, properly assembled, constituted something that could travel beyond a county sheriff and reach a different kind of authority entirely. When Harlan learned about the journal, he moved quickly. He did not know it was already gone. He believed he was stopping something before it could be sent. They came for Elias on a Tuesday night. Elias heard them before he saw them. The horses on the hard dirt road outside his house. More than one. The sound of men who are not trying to be quiet because they have never had to try. He was sitting at his table by lamplight, and he set down what he was reading and sat very still for a moment, and then stood and went to the door and opened it. There were 5 of them. Harlan in front, the others behind him in the configuration of men who let one man lead, because it means they can later say they were only following. Elias looked at each of them in turn. He looked at them the way his father had taught him to look at things he needed to remember steadily, without flinching, taking in every detail. He looked at Harlan's face, and he looked at the men behind him, and he looked at the chain that one of them was holding, and he did not speak, and he did not run, and he did not give them the satisfaction of seeing what they were hoping to see. Harlan said, "You've been keeping records, boy." Elias did not answer. Harlan said, "Whatever you wrote is going on the fire tonight. And so are you." What happened next took less than 5 minutes. They bound him. They loaded him on a horse. They rode to the river. On the bank, before they put the chain on him, Harlan stepped close and reached into Elias's left coat pocket. He found a river stone. He held it up and looked at it in the moonlight. He said, "What good is a stone?" And he threw it into the water. He threw it before they threw Elias. The stone went into the dark water first, into the deep, slow channel where the Yazoo ran darkest, and it disappeared without a sound. Then they chained Elias and put him in after it. From the tree line at the southern edge of the bank, Josephine Merritt watched. She was 62 years old, and she had lived in the settlement for 30 years, and she had watched it be dismantled piece by piece and family by family, and she had not been able to stop any of it, and she was not able to stop this, and she stood in the dark between the trees, and she watched, and she did not make a sound because making a sound would have accomplished nothing except adding her own name to whatever accounting was being taken that night. She watched Elias go into the water. She watched the men right away. She stood at the tree line for a very long time after they were gone. Then she heard something in the river, something below the surface, something that was not the current and was not a log and was not any animal she had ever known to live in the Yazoo in 30 years of living beside it. Something old, something that had been there long before the settlement, long before Harlan Croft, long before any of the men who had ever ridden to this bank believing the river would simply take whatever they gave it and keep quiet about it. The water moved in a way that water does not move on its own. At the tavern in town that night, Harlan sat at the bar with his 4 men around him and drank and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has removed a problem. He told himself the settlement would be finished by spring. He told himself there was nobody left who could put what he had done on paper in a way that anyone with authority would read. He told himself the journal, wherever it was, would turn up and be handled. He ordered another round. He talked about what he was going to do with Elias's land. He laughed at something one of the men said. He did not think about the river. He did not think about what the river might be thinking about him. 3 days. That was all the time it took. He did not think about what lives in slow water, what waits in the deep channels where the current folds back on itself, and the light never reaches and the river keeps what it keeps. His father had known. Thomas Drummond had told Elias about it when he gave him the stone. He had not called it by name, because some things do not have names that belong to human languages. He had simply said, "The river has memory. Everything that has ever been done on its banks, everything that has ever been put into it, everything that has ever been asked of it, the river holds all of it. It does not forget, and when the weight of what it holds becomes too great, it decides what to do about the balance." Elias had been sitting at the river for 27 years. He had never once doubted his father's words. He had the stone in his pocket when they threw him in. He knew it had gone in before him. He knew it had gone to the deep channel. And as the water closed over him and the weight of the chain pulled at his wrists and the cold of the Yazoo pressed against his chest like a hand, he felt, in the darkness below the surface, that he was not as alone as Harlan Croft had intended him to be. Something was already there. Something that had been there for a long time. Something that recognized the stone. Josephine stood at the tree line until the river settled. It took a long time. The water moved in ways she had never seen it move, and then it was still, and then it was simply the Yazoo again, dark and slow and keeping its own counsel. She stood there until the sky began to change in the east, the first pale suggestion of morning spreading above the tree line on the far bank. Then she walked home. She did not sleep. She sat at her table with her hands folded and she waited, the way she had learned to wait over 30 years of living in a place where waiting was sometimes the only power available to you. She waited for 3 days. On the morning of the third day, before the sun was fully up, she heard something on the path outside her house. She did not go to the window immediately. She sat at her table for a long moment, breathing, and she said a prayer that was not in any language the church had given her, but that she believed the thing she was praying to would understand regardless. Then she heard her name, spoken quietly. From the path outside, she knew the voice. She went to the door and opened it. Elias Drummond was standing on the path in the early morning light, wet to the skin, the chain marks on his wrists raw and dark. His left hand closed around something small and smooth and gray that she could see even from the doorway. His coat was gone. His shoes were gone. He was standing barefoot on the cold earth of the path, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been to a place that changes the way you see everything that comes after it. He said, "Is anyone hurt?" She said no. He nodded. He looked down at the stone in his hand. Then he said, "I need to get to Memphis." Memphis was 4 days north by the fastest route Elias knew. He did not wait for daylight to finish arriving. He dried himself at Josephine's fire, took the coat and boots she gave him from a chest that had belonged to her late husband, and was on the road before the settlement woke up. He told Josephine only what she needed to know, that the journal had already been sent, that Walter Graves in Memphis had it or would have it, and that whatever happened next needed to happen faster than Harlan Croft could react to it. Josephine listened. She did not ask him about the river. She did not ask him what had happened below the surface or what had freed the chains or how a man thrown into the Yazoo with iron on his wrists had come back on his own 2 feet 3 days later with his father's stone in his hand. She was 62 years old and she had lived beside that river her whole adult life, and she understood, with the knowledge of a woman who has paid very close attention to the world around her for a very long time, that there are things the river does that do not require explanation from the people they're done for. They simply require witnessing. She helped Elias onto the road and watched him go. She went back inside and she sat at her table and she folded her hands, and this time she did not pray for safety. She prayed for speed. Elias reached Memphis on the morning of the 5th day. Walter Graves was a black attorney who had been practicing in Memphis for 14 years. Long enough to understand that the law in the state of Mississippi and the law as it was written in Washington were two different things, and that the distance between them was both the source of most of the suffering he had spent 14 years trying to address and the space inside which, occasionally, something useful could be made to happen. He had received Elias's journal 4 days before Elias arrived. He had read it in a single sitting, which was something he almost never did with documents. He was a careful, methodical reader who believed that first impressions of legal evidence were unreliable and that the truth of a document revealed itself on second and third reading. He read Elias's journal once and did not need to read it again to know what it was. It was exactly the kind of documentation that people like Harlan Croft spent their entire lives ensuring would never exist. Specific, dated, corroborated by the names and testimonies of multiple families. Land records referenced against county registration documents that Walter had already pulled and compared. A 2-year accounting of a systematic campaign that, properly presented to the right federal authority, constituted a case of civil rights violation under the Reconstruction-era statutes that still technically applied in Mississippi. However aggressively the state government worked to ignore them. When Elias walked into his office on the 5th morning, Walter stood up from his desk and did something he had not done in 14 years of practicing law in Memphis. He said, "How are you alive?" Elias sat down across from him. He put his hand in his coat pocket and felt the stone. He thought about his father at the river. He thought about the weight of the chain below the surface and what had been in the water with him and what it had felt like when the iron opened. He said, "The river gives and the river keeps. My father told me that. I understand it better now than I did." Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the journal on his desk and said, "Tell me everything that happened after this was written." What happened next moved faster than Harlan Croft had prepared for, because Harlan Croft had spent 6 years operating in a county where the speed of consequence was entirely within his control, and he had come to mistake that control for immunity. Walter Graves had a contact in the Federal Reconstruction Office in Nashville, a man named Agent Philip Hearn, who had been looking for exactly the kind of documented case that Elias's journal represented. Within 10 days of Elias's arrival in Memphis, Hearn had traveled south with 2 colleagues and a federal warrant that the county sheriff could not dismiss or delay without risking his own position, which was a calculation the county sheriff made in approximately 45 seconds before stepping aside. The warrants for Harlan Croft and the 4 men who had ridden with him were served on a Wednesday morning. Harlan had been at his property when the federal officers arrived. He had been eating breakfast. He was still holding his coffee cup when they read the warrant. He said, "This is Mississippi. You have no authority here." Agent Hearn said, "The statute under which this warrant was issued is federal, Mr. Croft. Mississippi's opinion of it is not legally relevant." Harlan looked at the warrant. He looked at the men behind Hearn. He looked at his coffee cup. He set it down. The trial, when it came, was not swift. Nothing involving federal Reconstruction law in Mississippi in 1887 was swift, but it was thorough. Walter Graves presented the journal. He presented the land records. He presented the testimony of 11 black families from the settlement who had, now that there was a federal framework protecting them from immediate retaliation, found their voices for a record that would outlast the men who had tried to silence it. Harlan Croft was convicted of civil rights violations and land fraud. 2 of the 4 men who had ridden with him received lesser convictions. The stolen land documents were voided. The families whose acreages had been taken were given the legal foundation to reclaim what had been theirs. It was not everything. It was not justice in the complete sense that the word deserves. The law in 1887 Mississippi was a partial instrument at best, and Walter Graves understood its limits as precisely as he understood its possibilities. But it was a record. It was a finding. It was something that said, in the formal language of a federal court, that what had been done to these families had been seen, had been named, and had consequences. That was more than any of them had been promised when they built their homes beside the Yazoo. In the weeks after the warrants were served, the settlement along the western bank breathed differently. Not easily. Nothing about their situation was easy, but differently, with the specific quality of air that arrives when something that has been pressing down on a community for 6 years is lifted even partially, and the people under it can feel, for the first time in a long time, the difference between its presence and its absence. Elias returned to the settlement on a Thursday morning in late October. He walked the last mile on foot, the way he had always walked it, through the tree line where the path narrowed before opening onto the cleared land of the settlement. His feet knew this ground. He had walked it 10,000 times. He walked it now the same way he always had, without ceremony, without announcement, because he was not a man who required either. He went to the river first. He stood at the bank where they had thrown him in. The same shelf of mud and root and dark water. The same slow current. The same deep channel where the Yazoo ran darkest. The chains were gone. The marks in the mud from that third morning had been washed smooth by subsequent days of water. The river looked exactly as it always had. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out the stone, smooth, gray, flat, worn on one face from 30 years of water moving over it. The same stone his father had given him. The same stone Harlan had thrown into this water before him. Contemptuous of it, unable to understand the weight of what he was dismissing. The stone had come back to him in the dark below the surface, pressed into his hand by something that had no name, but that recognized what the stone was and understood that it belonged to him. He held it for a moment. He looked at the water. He said quietly, "My father told me the river gives and the river keeps." I did not understand until the night I was in it that he meant both things at the same time. He put the stone back in his pocket. He turned and walked back toward the settlement. Josephine Merritt was at the edge of the clearing when he came through the tree line. She had been there for 20 minutes. She did not know why she had come to stand at the edge of the clearing at that particular hour, only that something had told her to, and that she had learned over 62 years to trust those instructions when they arrived. She watched Elias come through the trees. She watched him walk across the cleared ground toward the settlement, his coat on, his pace unhurried, the expression of a man who has been to a place the rest of the living world has not been, and has come back carrying something from it that he will hold quietly for the rest of his life. She thought about the night at the tree line, about the water moving in ways it should not have moved, about standing in the dark for hours waiting for something she could not name, and then hearing his voice on her path 3 days later and knowing before she opened the door what she would find. She thought about 30 years of watching the settlement absorb what was done to it and persist, about the families who had stayed, about the ones who had been driven away, about the specific kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like simply continuing to exist in a place that is trying to make your existence impossible. She thought about a stone thrown into dark water by a man who did not understand what he was throwing, and about what the water had decided to do about it. Elias reached the near edge of the clearing. He saw Josephine at the tree line. He raised one hand. She raised her hand in return. She watched him walk into the settlement, past the houses, past the gardens, past everything that was still standing because enough people had refused to leave it, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. There's a thing that happens to black communities in America, and that happened to black communities in Mississippi in 1887, that the official record consistently fails to fully capture. The record captures the law. It captures the findings. It captures the convictions when they come, and the land restored when that comes too. What does not capture is what it costs a people to survive the years before any of that arrives. The daily weight of living in a place that has decided your presence is optional. The specific kind of strength required to wake up every morning and tend your land and help your neighbors and teach your children and build something worth building in a county that is actively trying to unmake it. Elias Drummond had lived that weight for 34 years. His father had lived it before him. The families of his settlement had lived it for 20 years beside the Yazoo, on land they had claimed and worked and tried to hold. The river had been listening the entire time. It had been listening when Thomas Drummond sat at its bank and taught his son to be still. It had been listening when Josephine Merritt stood at the tree line in the dark and watched and did not look away. It had been listening when Elias wrote down every date, every name, every stolen acre, in a journal wrapped in oilcloth and sent north on a wagon. Some things cannot be drowned. Some things the water holds rather than takes. Some truths are older than the men who try to silence them, and the river knows the difference. Harlan Croft had thrown a stone into the Yazoo and called it worthless. The river had kept the stone and returned it, and with it, returned the man they had thrown in after. Not as a miracle, as an accounting. The river remembered everything. It always had. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the path he had walked. She looked at the sky above the Yazoo, where the morning light was coming in low and gold across the water. The river remembered. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to know that the things done in darkness are not always kept in darkness. And tell me in the comments, what do you think the creature in the river was? Justice or something older than justice? I will see you in the next story.